You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Infinite diversity.
Live long and prosper, and welcome to Infinite Diversity, a Star Trek Universe podcast, here on the BQN Podcast Collective. I'm your host for today, Thad, and joining me is my co-host, Chrissy. How are you today?
Oh, I am all right. We usually make a joke here, and I cannot think of anything. So I'm just going to say I'm good, and I'm looking forward to talking about this episode.
Yeah, I feel like most of the jokes we might make would seem a little in poor taste, so I will go with you on that and say that I am also doing all right and ready to talk about Star Trek. Also joining us today is Heather Barker from Mission Log Live. Heather, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I, in turn, am also feeling serious and somber about this episode and ready to talk about it.
Perfect. Before we jump into that topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our Patreon patrons who make our show possible, particularly our associate producers, Carl Wonders and Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi. Listeners, you can hear your name listed as one of our associate producers for a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly Patreon subscription of just $5, you can join our meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. All right, so we're continuing the very wildly swinging tonal feeling of the episodes in the second half of Strange New Worlds Season 2 with Under the Cloak of War, which is a very different episode from last week's Those Old Scientists, and presumably a very different episode from next week's So Space Rhapsody. But despite being different, I thought it was fantastic personally, and a very deep topic and a very important topic. Heather, what did you think this week?
Yeah, again, definitely very different from last week's episode. And it's something that I've commented on is I am actually appreciating, even though, yes, it can be a bit jarring to go from a lighthearted, fun, happy episode to something so serious and somber. I still enjoy that this episode or this season of Strange New Worlds has followed up the deeper episodes or the heavier episodes with something palate cleansing.
Yes.
It's something that I struggled with Picard and sometimes Discovery, and I love them, but being in that cycle of every episode is, you're going to deal with some deep subjects. It gets to be a lot. And I will say that in the past, I have even gone from watching Star Trek to watching an episode of The Orville, which also gets heavier in later season, like season 3 and whatnot. But just the tonal shift, it was like, oh, okay, this is a little bit lighter. I'm not walking away with these deep, and it's good to engage those deep thoughts and to make you think. But this episode especially was very, very heavy, and I think very, very relatable for people who have been in the service, which I have not myself. I have tons of family that have been, and I have listened to the feedback of veterans through social media, and their responses have been really eye-opening. This episode seemed to resonate strongly with them as well. And so I'm appreciative of the discussion that it has encouraged. I think that it was very well done overall. I think that the discussions have brought a lot of different perspectives that we should all listen to. But ultimately, I think that this season has been pretty strong, and this episode probably one of the strongest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hard to argue with any of that. All right. Chrissy, what did you think this week?
Oh, Yeah, heavy. A story that I think people need to wrestle with the trying to think how I want to put this. People need to wrestle with what happens to people that are forced into situations where they have to kill other people. And that's a lot of human history has been killing people, people killing people, certainly. But it's not as normalized, thankfully, now as it was, in ancient Rome, something like that. I also think, I know a lot of the focus, and rightly so, has been on the Mbenga story. I think I saw in the story about Doc Ra the issue of rehabilitated Nazis, too, an allegory there. So, can you actually trust the people against whom you fought? So I think there's something to that, too. Yeah, we'll get into as we go. It's hard to summarize this in just a quick, few sentences.
Fair. Yeah, I hadn't even considered the Nazi angle, but it makes sense. I mean, just in general, how can you trust a reformed war criminal, and how reformed actually are they?
Yeah.
This episode definitely goes into some serious, deep stuff like right away. So we've got the Enterprise is picking up a Federation ambassador, and he's a Klingon, which is not what you would necessarily expect from a Federation ambassador in the 23rd century.
This character is compelling, and when we're talking about, the possibility of whether it aligns with like the reform Nazi situation, I see this character differently than it seemed a lot of other viewers did. And that is based on my own personal life experience with certain kinds of people who, in the beginning, when we meet him, he does seem like a nice guy, I guess. Like he's there for peace. I thought it was pretty bizarre that yes, he's an ambassador, but then as we're moving into the episode, Ortegas explains this Butcher of Chagall situation that he killed his men, and has this reputation. And the more that I learned about him throughout the episode, the more I stopped buying into what he was trying to sell the audience. So I think in the beginning, like a lot of us are kind of taken by, I don't know, he seemed like a nice guy. But then as we move through, and I don't want to jump ahead through the timeline and stuff, but as we move through the episode,
we do that all the time.
he definitely, it's, for me, the more that we learn about him, the more that I see someone who is, whether or not he's actually there for peace, I don't think that he is there in a way that is serving the Federation or other people. I believe that he is doing this job because it helps validate who he is. It gives him notability. It makes people look up to him, and in his own words, act like he's a saint. And that, to me, aligns with narcissistic personality disorder. The fact that he is lying and manipulating the people around him by believing in this story, and trying to sell these lines about healing. And as someone who's been involved with someone with narcissistic personality disorder, but also been a victim of domestic assault, and in other experiences in my life having to confront a person who has abused me, the fact that they set up this episode to begin with asking the crew to step away from your own issues, and sit down and have dinner with this person who's abused you, who there's no healing here. Like if Ra had truly been on a path of healing, that would have led him to tell the truth about who he was and what happened. Like, that is what healing is. So, especially as we get to the end of the episode, and that is coming up again, infuriating to hear someone like that talk about healing when what they're doing is not healing. Yeah, I've been in the room. I've had to sit down with my abuser. I didn't have to have dinner with them, but it is one of the worst things that you can ever do to people. And I was like, what Federation is like, is this the mirror universe again that they're asking this to happen? Because it's just wrong. And I'm glad that Una did bring it up towards the end of the episode and said we need to get him off the ship, and that you can't force these people to heal. They must do that in their own timeline. And I think that a point of this episode, really for everyone, for anyone who has dealt with, you know, this level of trauma, whether or not you have PTSD or CPTSD like me, healing is not linear, and there's no goalpost. There's no, I'm healed now. That's not how it works. And ultimately, for me, this episode highlighted the fact that there are some things that you don't heal from. You manage the trauma that you carry throughout your life. There's no final day of healing where it's okay now.
Honestly, even before we knew we find out what his deal actually is, he seemed too good to be true when he appeared. Like, what's up with this super friendly, personable Klingon, and what's really happening here? Because this is not the sort of thing we would expect. Yeah.
And he's still responsible for massacre.
Right. There's that too.
And so I, again, like, please tell me the story of how he made it to be a Klingon ambassador. Again, is this the mirror universe? Because regardless, and I mean, they're aware that he is this butcher of Jagal, and maybe in that storyline, okay, he killed his whatever. Regardless of all that, he still is responsible for killing innocent people on top of soldiers. And so how anybody gets to be an ambassador is just beyond me. And again, when it comes to people, whether you want to say he has narcissistic personality disorder or not, there is, with a lot of people like him who hide what they have done, the mask that they present to the public is one that convinces you that they are a good person.
Oh, yeah.
That they are trustworthy, that they are healing, that they have reformed. And so I totally even get the audience buying into that because it's something that happens and we don't realize when that's happening to us because we believe that face. We believe what is being presented to us.
Yeah.
Especially if you are someone who is raised, as Mbenga calls out, like most of us have the privilege of thinking that, thinking of the best in people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for some of us, including myself, I can no longer default to believing in the best of people because that has harmed me. That has deeply affected and traumatized me. And I haven't been to war, so that's a whole other level. This is just my own life story. So to me, I tweeted about it. I was like, why is nobody talking about this character and how deceitful this character was? They're focusing on the actions that happen at the end of the episode, which we have talked about and we perceive in a certain way. And we know from what Davy Perez, the writer, said that the ending is supposed to be ambiguous. However, I didn't feel it was ambiguous. But as we've said, Thad, like you go online and other people have a different perception. So yes, so in that case, it is ambiguous. But I don't want to what is the expression? Like, lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel like this episode, and from what I saw in the Ready Room and have read in interviews, like, this episode is largely focused on representing soldiers going to war and how it can change them irrevocably.
Mm-hmm.
And weaving in this character who, to me, represents people that I have dealt with and people who have harmed me. And oh my gosh, if you put me in a room with someone and that person ignored my 6 warnings, my 6 requests to leave me alone, what would I do in that moment? Especially if I felt I needed to defend my safety. And that's where I think it gets lost and a little ambiguous.
Yeah, and if we want to jump ahead to the very end briefly,
by all means,
I will say I thought that Doc Ra had obvious motive for attacking and killing M'Benga because M'Benga knows his secret. And that's why he first was like, well, you can still work with me. We can, because it's good. But when M'Benga says, no, I'm not going to work with you, he's like, oh no, he's going to tell on me. And
yeah,
it was very clear to me that he initiated the attack and M'Benga defended himself. Now, I've talked to multiple people who had a very different view on that. So clearly it was not necessarily as clear as I thought. But even if we put behind the fact whether or not he killed his generals to prevent them from committing more genocide and then defected to the Federation, or whether what we find out is actually happening is M'Benga was sent to assassinate him and killed his generals, and he managed to get away and defected to the Federation so he wouldn't get caught and die. Regardless of what happened here, I don't blame him at all for wanting to defect and say, "Oh, I'm going to join this side, and then you won't try to kill me anymore." That part, totally down with. The lying about what happened, yeah, that's kind of a problem. But even beyond that, if we don't even touch on that, he's still not a good guy, because there's still that whole thing where he made the order that anyone who is not part of the Klingon fighting force is the enemy, including civilians. And that's a problem.
Children.
Yes.
Children. And yes, this type of personality does not want anyone to know the truth. The only people that know the truth about them, and again, I'm taking this out of context, are people who know them privately, like someone's partner, someone's parent, etc. That finding out the truth is revealing. So I don't believe that Ra actually regrets or is ashamed of his he doesn't regret killing people. He's not ashamed of having killed people. What he is worried about is how people will think of him, because again, other people's perceptions of him is what validates him. So if people know that he is that person, he did those things, that ruins him. And that is what he is afraid of. And that is why I agree that it absolutely makes sense that he would want to kill M'Benga once M'Benga revealed that he was the butcher, which the wording around that, I would just say I'm the one that killed those people. Because M'Benga is not a butcher. What we know of M'Benga is that he entered Starfleet at some point, we believe as a medical officer. I'm not totally sure. This episode definitely brings character development that we've had hinted at, but has not been confirmed. That apparently he seems to have been special ops, and whatever they had him doing in special ops led to him having the most hand kills in combat, or kills in hand combat, however they framed that. So he did have to kill people. He was referred to as the Ghost, which again tells me some kind of special ops. So M'Benga created that protocol. I don't have the number in front of me.
12.
Protocol 12, which is the super serum that we saw in episode 1 that I thought was, God, am I watching a Marvel movie? Like, what is happening? I don't like this. So I'm glad that they revisited and gave us some context that he created it, and that both M'Benga and Starfleet don't want it to be used any longer. That it is dangerous. We should not use it. He's not going to give it to anybody. He will keep it for himself, and he will give some to Nurse Chapel to protect her, but he's not going to give it to anybody else. Somewhere in all of this, he wound up being a doctor and just wanting to heal. And we have those scenes with the ensign who had to have the heart stimulation. And they have that conversation of, why are we here? I joined Starfleet to explore. And M'Benga just talks about, I wanted to be a healer. I came here to heal people and to learn about healing. And now this is what has happened in war. But what we know of M'Benga is that he is not, I don't see any evidence that he is a war criminal. I see evidence that he was potentially put in a situation where he had to kill people. And to me, that is something very, very different.
Yeah.
Because that's not something that you sign up to do. And being forced in that situation, he came out of it. He knows that he doesn't want to go back to something like that. He doesn't want it to change him.
Yeah.
I feel like whatever he was doing that was special ops may not have been as destructive as what he had to do to end the massacre at Athos and kill. I don't know. Like, we don't have that information, but I don't see somebody who is ever intent on killing. I think that what we're left with at the end of this episode is the reality that sometimes in war, you are forced to kill, you are forced to do unspeakable things, and that damages you irrevocably. You can go to all the therapy in the world, but some of that stuff you cannot return from.
I will say that, I think M'Benga thinks of himself as the butcher, but
absolutely.
Yes, I wouldn't classify him as a butcher. He was a soldier performing a mission. There's a big difference. Assassinating a leader in a time of war is a pretty typical thing that happens during war.
That's part of war. Yeah.
And I would not call him a butcher. I would call him, he was performing his duty as a soldier.
Yeah.
And he didn't enjoy it.
No.
When you talk about, you call somebody, we have, I think the only other time we've had something like that on Trek was the Butcher of Galatep, right? And that's the idea of enjoying the killing. And I know there's a lot more to that episode. Not getting into that, but the way this is laid out really does make me think about how wars are presented after the fact. And World War II has always been the good war, right? We had to do World War II because otherwise fascism would have taken over. Forget about what's going on in this country right now, but that's another issue. And that's how M'Benga, when he's talking about why he's there fighting and why they are at war at all, this is the good war. We have to do this. Okay. So it's just, I think there's a lot of World War II allegory in here, which I'll, get more into as we go. But yeah, it's very, very heavily skewed in that, I think, which is not, skewed isn't the right word there, but leaning toward that. I don't think we've really seen that with the Klingon War in this way. Because it was very much depicted as, well, not that it wasn't needed, not that it wasn't kind of inevitable, but it definitely was not presented as that necessary evil that you get from this. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but yeah. Listeners, you can tell me off. That's fine.
Tweet your complaints too.
Yes, always.
Or whatever they're going to call that on Twitter these days.
I mean, we've seen bits and pieces of the Klingon War, and then with Strange New Worlds, uh, there has been a tonal shift between seasons with Mbenga. I'm not going to ignore the fact that the first season, though we did have, I think, allusions to him having been in war, having been in the service. I think the eye thing with Lon came up in season 1 and not just season 2. I feel like we saw that, like the eye motion that they do that we still don't see, but I feel like we saw that previously, so we knew that he had served before. And season 1 was largely focused on his daughter Rukia, and that story, and him being a father, and him eventually saying goodbye to Rukia, even though she did not necessarily die. She ascended. Well, I like to use ascended.
Yes,
she
I like that.
Evolved into another being, or she's out there living a life. She checked in. She said, "Dad, I'm okay." And for me, I've struggled a bit with he's not dealt with that trauma at all, because that is still a substantial life event that you would need to work through, and the fact that we kind of have left it there, I found a bit jolting that we moved from that into now we're going to explore his time as a soldier. That was a shift for me that I think has been a little difficult, but I set those things aside in order to be immersed in this season. But we talked a little bit about the show about wars and not the nature of wars, but we talked about Vietnam, and I shared a little bit about my biological father's experience. And so this was my father's experience and not my personal experience. So I'm only sharing what I know, and I'm not sharing any details.
Sure.
But it gave me a perspective for this episode that I found very valuable. And that is that my dad was in the Navy. My dad spent his time on submarines. He was not there. He did not join to hurt people. But my dad was sent to Vietnam. And while he was in Vietnam, he was, as he tells it, co-opted and or forced to be a sniper. And all you are doing as a sniper is killing people.
Right.
Yeah.
That is what you are focused on. And again, I'm not going to share details of what he was forced to do or stories he ever told me, but I can tell you that as his daughter, being forced to kill people changed him in ways that he would never recover from. And because of that, because of what he went through, he could not be a parent. And that to me was enough to understand Mbenga having supposedly, I mean, I'm coming to these conclusions based on what little we know, and there's still more to know. There's still more to learn. I don't know if we'll ever get it, but it is that you go into the service, and I think anyone goes into the service knowing that they may be expected to kill. They may be in a situation where they have to kill someone else, but I think it's a different thing to go in, like as we saw in this episode, wanting to explore, wanting to do, not wanting to avoid that in any way, but having that taken from you and being forced to kill people. I know for a fact that that's just something that you don't come back from. And I think that, sure, some people may be given therapy, coping skills, whatever, that helps them manage those memories and that pain better. I think that I wish that we could give that to every veteran. I know we say the resources are out there, but it's not that easy.
Yeah.
Right.
And
No, it is not.
even if every veteran did have that opportunity, I still fully believe, and I say this not because of just what I know from my father, but because of my own life experiences, having essentially a damaged nervous system from the trauma that I've gone through my entire life. Again, there's no aha moment that everything has gone away. You learn how to manage, and that is why the comments about the bio bed resonated so strongly, and that's why we ended on the fact, and let's see if I actually wrote it down. Some things break in a way they can never be repaired, only managed. And to me, this is the essential message of the episode, is that some people out there can only manage, can only go through life surviving and knowing that they carry this with them. And at any time, that bed might break down again. You might find yourself in that place. And nobody wants to go back out and kill people. Like it's not about that. It's not that Mbenga carries this deep rage that could explode any moment. It's not that. It's the fact that people who have experienced this are constantly managing all of the symptoms of the trauma that they carry. And so I think this is where I've seen some calls for empathy out there. And this is where I think some of that empathy must be extended, especially because, again, my life trauma is not the same as having gone to war and experienced what my father did. I can only relate and how they are similar. And if you are so lucky to have not served, have not experienced that, have not been deeply affected or changed by trauma, I think it's just important to take a minute to look at it objectively and realize that, okay, I might not be able to understand this, but maybe through empathy and compassion, I can. And having said that, I'm not implying that people are out there not being empathetic or anything like that. There's been conversations, and I'm just going to bring it up now because why not? Especially if we're here for 2 hours.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
There's conversations around the character of Mbenga and this happening to him specifically, and specifically because he is a Black man. And we are all white on this podcast. And so I want to point that out. And I am not looking to speak over anyone at all. I think that you should be listening to your Black friends and what they are saying about this episode.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
When I watched it, I certainly, especially when we see things like Mbenga, I mean, we see a panic attack first. That's his first reaction. Is this extreme panic attack. Panic attacks can be, I pick up my phone, I see a phone number that I know is my abuser, and my heart starts racing, my blood pressure drops, and I look normal if you look at me, but inside I'm panicking, I'm crumbling. Or it could look like what Mbenga was experiencing with heart palpitations and flashbacks and memories of being exactly in that place and hearing the noises and reliving it. There's a spectrum for panic attacks. But through this episode, we see some things like Mbenga is, has making a fist on his chair, or when he's sparring with Rock or Raw. Sorry, wrong show. It's not Rock. Hey, Star Trek Prodigy.
Rock Talk would never commit genocide.
No.
Exactly. Oh, and shoot, I was going to pull out my Rock Talk action figure, but I don't have one because they didn't make her. They canceled her. Okay, anyway. Moment of brevity there, or levity. Now I'm all distracted on my point that I was making. So we see them sparring, and it definitely looks like Ra is kind of kicking Mbenga's ass, but we know that Mbenga is a very experienced martial artist. Well, I don't want to say martial artist because that's specific to Babs, but for hand-to-hand combat, he excels at that. So while it looks like he's getting his butt kicked, I think he was kind of giving Ra. I mean, who knows? Who knows? But at the end, Omega comes very close to punching him, and he does not. Through this episode, we are seeing these things that I understand could lead people to think, okay, or see like, oh, he's really angry, and oh, he might explode. And I definitely felt a bit critical of this happening with the character, and I'm not going to say it's justified or anything else. When I watch this, I'm seeing signs of PTSD. I'm seeing controlled emotions. And as we've spoken about, we get to that end scene, which we've already talked about a little bit. But to me, yes, he's held on to the knife all this time, and he is alone when he pulls out that box and opens the knife. I don't see premeditation there. I see contemplation. Maybe he was thinking, what do I do? I don't know. But Ra walks in and he leaves the knife. And Mbenga asks over and over to leave me alone, go away. I think that Mbenga knows that if something were to happen, he would protect himself. I don't doubt that he has this rage against someone who has not sought or not been given justice. I don't know words. Who has not been held responsible, held accountable for the heinous deeds that they have done. But I don't see Mbenga being an angry black man. I see him as a soldier who is being triggered, who is in control up until the point where he is threatened. And again, we don't see who picks up that knife. And even if he did pick up the knife, to me, I see that as self-defense.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to, again, I don't want to speak over, I don't want to say that using this character for this is not problematic in some regard. But I think that in the context of this episode, the character Spock, the character is that's not how they are displaying him here. However, I will say, I think that what's important to realize in when we're using black male characters, especially in situations where they do display anger or violence, I think what's important here is to recognize our own systemic patterns of belief, racism or not, that maybe instead of seeing signs of PTSD, that inherent racism can play into perceiving those symptoms as violence and leading into believing that Mbenga was being violent. And I say this only because I have seen very specific feedback saying as such, and basically saying that he is as bad or worse than Ra. And I don't believe that at all. I don't think that is fair at all. And so we live in this world where, while I think that criticism of using this character in this way is certainly problematic, and that there is a stereotype out there that is very, very harmful to how we treat black men in this society, especially here in America. In the context of this episode, I don't think this episode is playing into that. However, I do think that our own perceptions have been influenced by the systemic racism that, whether you want to admit it or not, we are all learned throughout our lives. And as a white person, I work very, very hard to address and break down for myself. And I think that they can both exist here, but that at least for me in this episode, there's so much more than that, and I don't see Mbenga as that type of character. I don't see Star Trek making an intentional point to do that. However, yes, I do believe that in the larger context, it can be problematic. Hopefully that all makes sense and addresses that in a way that, again, I want to clarify that I'm not speaking against anybody. I think there is a room for all perceptions and opinions, and I think that it is valuable to listen to others and what they bring to the conversation, especially with Strange New Worlds. But for me, this episode just it was something else.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's placing to read it that way is dismissive of what he's going through, because it makes it just like, oh, that's just his nature, end of story. And that's not right. That's not right. You could take this story, and not that you couldn't take that with other stories, but I mean, you could have put Ortegas at the center of the story, and it would have worked just as well.
Right? Or Chapel. I've heard people say put Chapel there, and that would have been interesting. And yes, I mean, I am all for using one of those characters over this character instead of this character. I think especially because Mbenga was forced to become someone he didn't want to become, and that that choice is taken away from you. You don't get to say no. That makes it especially hard. I know that, again, I have in all aspects of family, blood relation, step family, found family, many veterans, and no experience is a monolith, and that's why I've never talked about my dad's experience or what he had to do. I'm talking about it now because it applies so well to Mbenga's own experience, and I think that it is unique. I don't think that everyone in the service is co-opted to do what my dad had to do. And the pain of just knowing that, and knowing how it damaged him as a human being. And again, I don't think that we've seen that with Mbenga. I think, to the extent of my father was unsalvageable. There was no coming back. And I think that Mbenga is in a better place than that, but it's that specific experience that for me as an individual, it just affects me deeply in how I see this episode. And I feel that this episode resonates so strongly because I know this. And I'm just sharing that to maybe help provide another perspective that other people might relate to. And I don't think that my dad was a monster. I don't think that Mbenga is a monster. I think they were forced to do horrific things. And again, that's where having that empathy and compassion come into play, especially if it's something that you've never experienced or been involved with or can even imagine.
No, that goes along with it being it's not a World War II allegory, but it goes along with that idea of the good war. I think veterans coming back from World War II, and this is not to say that there were not issues. I'm absolutely 100%. Okay. I don't know. The difference between killing Nazis and killing for political machinations that have to do with how the world fell out after World War II and, wanting to make sure that communism didn't get places, and all of the political reasons that Vietnam happened, that was not about saving the world, to make it drastic. Mbenga emphasizes he killed children. He killed children. He killed civilians. So there is, I think, a level of being able to justify it differently. And I'm not speaking for anybody's experience. I have not experienced this, but I can see where somebody who, you could take someone who was a sniper in World War II and take somebody who was a sniper in Vietnam, and that's a very different experience because of why you're there.
Yeah.
You know, this is not to say that the North Vietnamese did not kill children. I'm not getting into all of that, but the ideology behind it is so different, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's the only way I can see that Mbenga has been able to reconcile himself with this, justify it in his head, however you want to describe it. I think that has a lot to do with it. He felt like he was saving lives as opposed to just taking them.
Yeah, he felt like he was going to end that massacre by, ending Ra, and Ra got away, and that there's a whole other element to this episode of whether it's a war criminal or a rapist, having someone do heinous things and never be held accountable. Like, yes, we do have tribunals, Captain Pike, but that's not always justice. There are plenty of times when people are acquitted, get away with it, etc. And so in my own personal experience, the justice system, that's not a guarantee. My rapist is out there still teaching the kids that he rapes. I don't know if he's doing it right now, but I did my best to try to hold that person accountable, and I did not receive help or justice. And so knowing that person is out there living their life and potentially preying on children still is, I can't explain to you the emotions, the feelings that I have about that.
Yeah.
So Mbenga having to be there with that person on a ship. And again, I emphasize that he was on board with doing it. He said, I will do this for the captain. I will do this for Starfleet. He even gave Ortega the pep talk. Like, let's go eat the jambalaya. Let's put on our Starfleet face. He guided all of these people despite his own emotions, despite that deep trauma, despite any anger that he felt. And when Ra walked in, he said, please go, leave me alone. Please. Again, it's like 6 times. I wrote it down. I wrote down all of the dialogue. Like, this is one, again, where I want the script. I said this about Ad Astra per Aspera, too, that I want a script of these because I think that they are powerfully written. And there are conversations about justice. And Mbenga said, what about justice? What about the victims? Doesn't everyone deserve to pay for their actions? Who decides? Who pays? Who gets redemption? Where's the line? And is there a huge conversation around it? I don't think Chris really knows what to say about it. And I think that some fans wanted more, but I don't think there is more. I think that Star Trek has this beautiful idea of, I guess it's the future where everybody does get justice. But if everybody got justice, you wouldn't have a Klingon ambassador. Like that's where it's just really messed up in my head where that happens. And so I think that, yes, there are parts of that utopia that sure we want to reach. But again, Star Trek is not just about the future. Star Trek is a story about what's happening today. And I was happy to see this discussion and have these questions asked and to come to the conclusion that there aren't answers. Because there are not. That is the world. The reality is that some of us live in a world where you don't trust people. I try very, very hard to believe in the best of people. I still live that way. It was built into my DNA and how I was raised, but I continue I continue to be harmed, especially if I don't set boundaries for that. And Benga set very clear boundaries. Those boundaries were ignored up until the point where we know that Rob put his hands on Mbenga. Mbenga says, "Get your hands off." Ross says, "So selfish a human." And Benga says, "Don't." And then we hear the knife. I think that some of the writing around this episode and the cover up at the end also kind of leads people to the notion that it was really, I don't know, it was wrong. It's like, because it was a cover up, it was wrong. And I mean, ideally, no, you don't want murder, but it's, to me, it would be different if it was just, there was no altercation, there was no threat to Mbenga. And that's something that I had to push back on, where somebody said that Ra was not a threat. He was not being threatening. To me, if you don't respect my boundaries, if you're I mean, Ra had already grabbed Mbenga when he was walking out of the dinner. He grabbed his arm.
Yeah.
And again, extreme control, because if you touch me like that, I will not respond in the same way. And I will tell you, that is my nervous system responding. I will swat your hand away. I think somebody pinched my butt in a club once, and I grabbed his hand so hard he did not know what was happening, and he like freaked out because I responded and he was not expecting that.
Maybe he shouldn't be touching people.
Exactly. And so even though, you know, this dinner scene, sure, maybe for a lot of people there's nothing unusual about Ra reaching out and grabbing Mbenga's arm, but holy cow, like that was really hard for me to see. But to see the control from Mbenga, to not react, wow, like I had respect for that. And it does remind me that Starfleet's members are the best of the best. And so despite all of these things, and despite places where I myself might still be reactive, Mbenga is not.
When he was talking about the thing with the justice, that sounded coherent, the thing with the justice, that people should basically he was saying people should pay for the crimes they've committed, right? I read that he was talking about himself too. Did you guys read that?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
think that Mbenga does, because Mbenga is a normal human being, that he does feel regret, remorse, shame. He calls himself a monster. And again, I know from personal experience how that does change a person and how that does affect how you feel about yourself as a human being. And I say this on behalf of my father, not because of me. So yes, he didn't want to do those things, and I don't think he necessarily wanted to kill Ra, but I also understand not being upset about it. And I don't know if that makes me a callous person. I mean, to me, it just speaks to my life experience. And it's taken me a long time to really understand that my life experience, and my life experience is not a normal person's life experience. And so the way that I see things and relate, I really have to step back and think, okay, like this is not normal. Like what I have lived through is not normal. And it's not going to be how a lot of people perceive or interpret things. And so again, that's just why sharing these perspectives, I think, is so powerful, and helps us learn from each other and see these episodes in ways that are different. And I think that so many of these perspectives, you know, are valid.
Absolutely.
The moral conundrum here, and it's been difficult for me to read feedback about this episode on social media. Because some people don't believe that there's a moral conundrum, that there's a discussion happening. And I'm not going to tell anybody they're wrong or right. I mean, what you get what you get out of this episode. I just hope that conversations like this illuminate places or things that others may not have seen. We may not get the paragraphs long dialogue that we got in TOS or even TNG. And again, I think it's for TV's sake, TV has changed, and how we write these episodes has changed. And whether or not you think that's justification is really up to you. But I think between the conversation with Una, how can we represent a federation that believes in peace if we say some people aren't allowed to make up for their past? And that's Pike. And Una says, I agree with you in the abstract, but the people he hurt, some of them right here in this crew, might not find forgiveness so easily. It isn't fair for us to ask them to just let it go. Federation or not, everyone is on their own journey.
Mm-hmm.
It might be succinct, but I think we're asking the question that a lot of viewers may be asking and answering it. And it may not be what people want to hear. It may not, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on what other people's perceptions are about it, but I think it is a good question. Like, are people, and I mean, this came up in Discovery with Georgiou.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have someone who's committed mass genocide who ends up being buddy, and she's Michael's bestie. And it was like, okay, was there like what? It's I don't know. I don't know what to say about it beyond that. Like there's definitely some ways Star Trek has been handling it that are questionable in my view. And I would like to think that everyone has the potential to engage in self-reflection, whether it's through therapy or what, and that for the most part, everyone should have the opportunity to make up for their past. But everybody is not we talked about the Nazi allegory, and
Mm-hmm.
that is really the question, is that what can you forgive? And let me forgiveness is for yourself. Forgiveness is not for other people. Forgiveness is something that you do. You forgive the people that have hurt you so that you can move on in life, and that is part of healing. Forgiveness does not mean that you allow people back in your life, that you forgive all the things that they have done. It is you making the statement that I'm going to put this in the past and move on. And there's no one size fits all for forgiveness as well. So I want to believe that everyone should be given that opportunity to make up for their past. But in order to make up for your past, you have to have a degree of self-awareness in order to do that. And Ra did not demonstrate that at all. Sure, he's selling you a story, but that story is false. And you know that because he never came forward with the truth. And it's really that simple.
Yeah. The way I view it is that it is ambiguous in universe because Chapel didn't see the beginning of the altercation.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, to me, as the viewer, it was not ambiguous in what happened.
Yeah. It felt like self-defense to me. And that is so clear for me that it is challenging to then go on and have discussions and see the perceptions of others that is so different. And I think that truly speaks to the art of the episode, much like Tuvik's.
Boy.
Where we will be talking about what was right, what was wrong, what happened, what didn't happen. for the rest of this episode's life, which is forever, because Star Trek never dies.
And also, I will just as to continue the Tuvix parallel, in the same way that regardless of which side you end up on vis-a-vis Tuvix, you are not necessarily a sexist. Regardless of which side you end up on vis-a-vis this episode, you are not necessarily a racist.
Agree.
Yeah.
And this is why I don't go on social media and resort to, you don't like this because you're racist. That's not going to get your point across ever.
No.
And I am not going to say that because you view Mbenga as being a cold-blooded killer, whatever, that you are racist. I am asking people to examine what about this episode led you to believe that. Can you see the evidence that we have given in our discussion that has led us to believe that this was self-defense and that these were not signs of aggression, but symptoms of trauma? And yes, aggression not aggression, but anger. Yes, of course, there is anger at what you are forced to do, what's been taken from you by being forced to do those things. I cannot lie and say that I am not angry at the people that abused me. And again, that's where forgiveness is for you. Forgiveness is supposed to help me come to terms with all of that and deal with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I can guarantee you, again, if one of the people in my life walked in, disobeyed my boundaries, and laid their hands on me, I would no longer turn into Bambi the deer and freeze up. I would react and protect my safety. And if that led to killing someone else, that is what I had to do to protect myself. That's the way that I see it. I think we kind of agree between the three of us as far as it being self-defense. And all I'm asking is that listeners be objective and try to see how we got to there and see if you got to there. I'm not gonna, it's not about saying you see him this way, so you are racist.
Yeah.
That is about examining our inherent bias that, at least as white people, for the most part in this country, we grow up with these biases.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a way to, in this moment, confront it. And I say all of this again with emphasis that, yes, I do agree that using this specific character for this storyline at a very base level can be problematic because, as we have already seen, he has been perceived as an angry Black man in those moments. And I think that speaks to the conversation being had about why it's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But I do in turn also feel that there is so much more to this episode that can be examined, that can lead you to perhaps see that these are not signs of that this discussion is, this episode is about trauma. It's about how it irrevocably changes us, especially soldiers forced to kill. And that doesn't absolve it, but it does bring so much more to the character. That's what I got.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was, because he talks about how he went looking, how Mbenga was looking for him. There is that moment of, did he feel the need to finish what he'd started? Did he feel the need to just get rid of kill this last person? But I think that is a lot less ambiguous. Excuse me. I think that's a lot less ambiguous with Mbenga as the character there than it would be for, again, I'll use Ortega's as the example. Okay. Because I think for Chapel, we're in the same kind of place as with Mbenga in terms of medical ethics and things like that. That's just not who he is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is that thought. That's a possibility, but I on examining that idea, I didn't see that for Mbenga. So yeah, that leaves it as self-defense.
I can see the writing leading us to, and that's where the ambiguity comes in, because it's very clear that Mbenga is very, very angry that not only Rod was never held accountable, he's now in a position of leadership and control, using the violence that Mbenga had to choose to do in order to end a war, using that for his own good. And yes, that stuff is infuriating. I still feel like, despite all of that anger and God, it's heartbreak. It's heartbreaking. I mean, that's truly, it's despair. I mean, and it's fear. Ultimately, it's fear of him becoming that again. And that's just what is so incredibly heartbreaking for me. But he's angry. It's in the dialogue. Like he's talking about, I looked for you and now here you are using the blood on my hands to make yourself a saint. Your work is built on lies. You never paid for what you did. Why did you have to come? Why couldn't you leave me alone? And that's where he opens the box with the knife, because I guess he had closed it and then he opens it. And so I think that moment kind of led people. And I mean, maybe in that moment, Mbenga was like, I don't know where this is going. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's necessarily evidence of premeditation. I don't think that keeping the knife or looking at the knife before Ra walked in was evidence of premeditation. But I think that Mbenga knew that if you keep pushing me, I will defend myself, and I will do that at all costs. Especially when you were trained to do that. And I'm not sure people understand. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm an expert, because I am not. I've never been in the service. But I do know from other friends who have worked in special ops, I'll say, you are so amped up on adrenaline in those moments where you are sparring, you are fighting, you are bringing someone down, that in many cases, what they will do is have someone step in. Like once you have secured the assailant, is that the word? I don't have, it's not my world, so I don't have the dialogue. But once you have secured that person, you step away. They bring someone else in to deal with, cuffing them, doing whatever, securing them, making sure that person cannot hurt anybody else, because you are so amped up on adrenaline, your nervous system is going haywire, that yes, you possibly could kill someone. Like that is a reality. That's just, it's not what happened here. There was, and yes, ultimately we would have liked to maybe have seen this walk away with nobody dying. And I still think that in that moment, Mbenga waited for the threat. Like he waited. He didn't just immediately say, "Oh, I need security. Ra's here, and I don't want him here." Maybe he should have. Maybe he should have said, "Then he won't leave. Security, please come and take him." That's not how this episode was supposed to go, though. This episode was.
I think if he had tried to do that, I think Ra would still have attacked him.
There wouldn't have been. I don't think there would have been time.
Like if he had called security, Ra's response would not have been, "Oh, I better leave. Security's coming."
Yeah.
That's all the more reason.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the evidence, what I have seen in circumstances where you are no longer affiliated with the person who is a bad person. You've seen what's behind the mask. You've seen the abusive nature. You've seen the lack of empathy. You've seen the non-emotions. You know how dangerous they are, and they don't want anybody else to know that. And so not only do they turn on you, like in any other worlds, Ra would have, if he had known, like if this had gone on, he would be the victim, and he would make his victims be the bad people. We never get that far.
Yeah.
I'm really curious what Ra meant in the altercation where, like, Mbenga leaves the knife. He says, "I said no." Ra says, "Don't be stupid." And Mbenga says, "You're a war criminal." And Ra says, "Don't you see it?" And I want to know what was meant by that. Like, what did Ra mean? What did you see that by sustaining a lie and...
He's trying to say, I think, he's trying to say that by sustaining the lie, he can be better at negotiating peace somehow. Like because by saying this, he's someone who believed in peace so much that he killed his own officers to perpetuate the peace, which is a weird argument to have. But I think that's what he's trying to say.
It's very evangelical Christian. It's very much like, I've done all the sins and I've asked for forgiveness, so I'm the best person to explain why you shouldn't do the sins.
A whole other box.
It is.
Oh boy,
it is, and not one we need to get into.
To open, that's another hour added to this podcast.
Indeed, it would be.
There was something in the beginning where, like, Ra, I know I wrote it down, but Ra said about the Klingons, because Spock wanted to know more about them, and he said, "There's nothing to experience. They are a warmongering race limited by ideology." And that was so bizarre to me, because that was so anti-Klingon from someone who is still a Klingon and an ambassador.
He makes so many statements throughout the episode about how terrible Klingons are, which I think is further evidence that this is performative and not his actual, the ideology he's actually behind. And he's saying these things because he thinks the Federation will be like, "Oh, this guy doesn't like Klingons either." I don't think he believes any of it.
No, I don't. I mean, he growls. He growled when the Raktuchino cup was too hot. He did kind of show that a little bit.
I made a note that he verbally reinforces the Klingon stereotype while presenting himself as the example that proves the rule.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And again, that is a sign, and I'm sorry I keep linking it back to NPD, but like that is a sign of delusion. It is their delusional world. They make this stuff up in their head to justify them being good. Their grandiose vision of themselves. Layers upon layers for this one.
Yeah.
Peace is not a destination. It's a journey, a state of mind.
I mean, that just sounds like a meme somebody would share on Facebook.
It does.
It totally is. It really, and there was just every time he just continues to do this. Now I am simply hoping to make up for my past and connecting with others who need healing like you. Saying that to Ortegas, and oh my God,
Yeah.
Ortegas in that moment reminded me of a scene from an episode of Mad Men. Did you guys watch Mad Men? Okay, so there's that episode where they bring in the Japanese clients.
Oh yeah.
And Roger just goes off on them completely. And nobody, I mean, people are looking at him and like intellectually they understand why, but they really don't.
Yeah.
You know. And so when Ortegas was talking on the bridge, that was exactly what I thought of, was that moment with Roger Sterling. I think there's another commentary going on here too, and maybe I'm reading way too far into this, but how many times have we dealt with people saying, well, oh, so-and-so isn't actually, this is perfect because it goes back to charades. Okay. You know, how many people were saying that T'Pring's father, Saval, was not, oh, obviously he's a Romulan because he's not acting like all the other Vulcans we ever met. And fans have had difficulty dealing with Klingons who aren't warrior class and who aren't bloodthirsty.
Mhm.
And, the Federation, well, the people that were involved in the war, okay, are going to have difficulty with the idea that there are Klingons who aren't bloodthirsty. And you can understand why. Forget what we know that happens in the future. You can understand why in the present, why that is.
I mean, yes. And I can tell you that the way that, sorry, this is like super personal and weird, but the way that I interact with most men, some people know this about my life and some people don't, but I was sexually assaulted as a child. I was groomed and assaulted in high school. And thanks to all this and having a father so affected by the war that he could not be a father, I never had boundaries. I was never taught about how men should treat you. And I was raised to be a people pleaser, being from a small town in Kentucky. I was raised to be, I'm going to become a wife. I'm going to become a mother. And I make everybody else happy. I put everybody else's needs before my own. And so that led me to being a perfect, hate the word victim, but it's a reality. A perfect victim for people who take advantage of others. And I think anybody who's known me like that has known me forever now. And I've seen my tweets and comments that I make. Like, so I've been called a misandrist at times, and that's not it. What it is that my experiences with men have led me now to always be on guard and always be questioning men's behavior with me, especially privately. And it is not a hatred. It is now for my own protection. It is now something, but it's a way that it has changed me. And so whether it's a bias or not, I mean, it's because of those life experiences. And so I can identify with Ortegas and anyone having been in that situation, having skepticism, especially with this character and the red flags that I saw. I have experience with people like this, so I could see right through it. And I don't think everybody saw that. I think a lot of people bought into, this is a person who is reformed. This is a person who is focused on peace. And that's just not the case. And it is unfortunate that life and our life experiences shape our perceptions of others in that way. But I think as much for how it applies to my own safety and how it applies to the crew's personal safety and safety of others. I understand them being on guard and being suspicious. And while Ortegas was immediately, like, that was an immediate reaction from her, I think throughout the episode, I was like, oh yeah, no, spot on. Like, that's good intuition. I don't trust him either. And I think someone like this, eventually, once he was found out, it would unravel for him. Like, you can't uphold that mask when other people know. And instead of taking the opportunity to become self-reflective, to indulge in self-awareness, and to actually do the healing and do the work needed to learn how to better manage all of that, he would actually be the one that explodes and ends up killing more people or doing something. And I think Mbenga knew that, and that is part of why he was not remorseful of what happened.
There's something I often think of when someone dies who has had a large adverse effect on society, let's say, is that I wouldn't have wished them dead, but society is better without them doing what they were doing, and not quite what Mbenga is getting at, but I did think of that too as we were watching it.
Yeah. Oh, no, there have been quite a few people like that.
Oh, I could name off a list right now, but I'm not going to do that. I mean, people will know who I'm talking about, and I'll say, unequivocally, Hitler, obviously. Though I think I would have wished Hitler dead. No, that's a different thing.
Well,
Anyway.
and I tend not to breach that conversation, but that name definitely came to mind in the conversation after watching this episode. And I tend not to go there because I don't know that it's very hard for me to talk about it. And not because of any familial relation or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was such an unspeakable horror that I have trouble, and I don't necessarily think it is correct to compare anything to the Holocaust and or to Hitler.
No.
Unless you're talking about a literal metaphor for the Holocaust, in which case that's fine. But I don't think this was.
Yeah. No. And I'm not getting to that. I was just, yeah.
We all know that Hitler committed suicide because of that same cowardice.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I believe if Hitler were put on trial and held accountable for his crimes, he would have been sentenced to death.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
There were plenty of Nazis who were sentenced to death for far less. So, yes.
Yes. And again, this comes into the question of, can the justice system, on any scale,
Mm-hmm.
truly be responsible for holding every criminal accountable? Because I believe if Doc Ra had been put on tribunal for all of this, he may have faced a similar fate or sent to prison.
I don't think it would have been death. I would like to think the Federation wouldn't do that.
Well, remember, the only death penalty on the books is going to Talos 4, so...
Which is still ridiculous.
That is true. And I guess ideally that is the point that a lot of fans are making, that in that reality it wouldn't have come to that no matter what. And this is where I think, again, yes, it's a beautiful vision, but it's a flawed reality.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That, yes, we want to get to there. I don't know that we will ever get to there. And I'm sorry for that, but
I'm pretty sure we will never get to there.
Yeah. In that world, he may be sent to a penal colony. I don't know. I don't know what would happen to him, but I also believe that in today's world, I don't know. If a person who, I don't know what the answer would be. I would hope that there would still be some form of justice, but I don't know. And that, again, whole other conversation to be had about the justice system, not just in our country, but in other countries, and how they don't provide a pathway to being reformed. It is just a death sentence. So I don't necessarily think that imprisoning someone for the rest of their life is always a better option. And not in a how to get just, I just mean for quality of life. The fact that so many people are murdered in our justice, in our, in our prisons in America, neglected, murdered by our system itself because of that neglect. I don't, again, that's a whole other hour added to this podcast that I will avoid going down that route.
One thing that struck me as really interesting, and something that in universe would not have been anything they would have considered in Starfleet, or Mbenga would have considered, was that Mbenga actually gave him an honorable death. He died at the hands of an enemy, and he will go to Sto-Val-Kor, and that's more than he deserved, I think. But within the context of Klingon culture,
Within the
That's it.
context, yes, but I also feel that Ra was outside of that context. Like, how was he Klingon? Like, it's a
Oh,
weird question to ask because he spoke so poorly of his own people.
He didn't believe
I
any
didn't
of
read
that.
that as genuine.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Okay.
No.
I had trouble like I can see how it was not genuine the way that he very much felt like he thought himself different from other Klingons in being this saint type character. So
Yeah. He knows what they want to hear.
Yeah. I don't think he thinks poorly of Klingons. He just knows that as a Klingon who ran from combat, he would be ostracized in his own society. So he allowed this mythos of him killing his generals to defect to happen.
Yeah.
yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of some lighter things to move into.
Hey, we got Clint Howard again.
Yeah.
We got Clint Howard again. Fun character, fun for what it was.
Mhm.
And I can't speak to all the very specific like bills and bows. I tried to look up what specifically that was, and I didn't get super far.
No, that's because all of his statements are weird mixtures of metaphors that don't make sense.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
a watched pot doesn't get the oil.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And it was fun to see him again. I mentioned the Raktuchino earlier, so that was kind of fun, and to see that continued from where Spock. I don't remember which episode. The first episode.
Yeah,
where
first
he
of the
was
season.
drinking with them and everything.
Mhm.
The putting Alvarado's pattern into the buffer
Oh,
stood out for me because I was like, that is how he keeps Rukia alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't remember if we had seen that come up before, like that practice.
other than Scotty and the guy in the Genoan, no.
Yes. Franklin, I think, was the name of the guy who died.
Yes. Yeah. And I thought when I saw that, I was like, oh, so this was something that maybe they were doing during the war. And that's where Scotty got the idea to do that. It wasn't quite as just this like crazy leap of genius, but something he'd seen done.
Yeah. And then, of course, having to kill him to save other people had to have been hard.
I think that speaks to whatever happened with Mbenga that we don't quite know about, where because I right now my head canon, the way I have filled this in is not that, like in my father's situation, for that he was taken away and made to do terrible things at that point, but that perhaps it was still a special ops, and in that special ops he was developing the serum, but yes, also doing the combat stuff. And I want to believe right now that was just enemies. I don't think that Mbenga was ever killing civilians or children or anything like that. I think he was just made to do war, and that this was fighting other enemy soldiers.
He was triaged, and what ended up, it only delayed the inevitable, I think.
And deleting the profile to be able to beam in more people is just another level of triage.
Yeah, and a less painful death than he would have had.
Yeah.
As strange as that sounds. I mean,
yeah,
it was very revealing to me that the idea of just give somebody a morphine drip and let them slip away has not changed.
No.
We have, we don't have any of our organ regenerators, so we have to revert to stone knives and bearskins. Or, as Pulaski put it, make a splint, because the bone knitter's not working.
Now, I wonder what medical breakthrough happens between now and like 20 or 30 years later in Star Trek 4 that McCoy is carrying around pills that let people grow new organs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a leap.
I think what I was going to say is that this just speaks to Mbenga has had that, we'll say, special ops experience and has had to learn being on the ground here, that sometimes you have to make those very hard choices. And I think those are just sadly real choices that have to be made on the battlefield, that you're presented with two patients, and especially when you don't have the tools, you have one patient who the likelihood of survival is very slim versus another patient that may be also in a terrible place but has a better prognosis, and it is a terrible choice. I mean, again, it's hard enough for me to wrestle with making the decision to put my pets to sleep.
Right.
Like,
yes,
that is the closest thing that I get to choosing whether another being lives or dies. And having done this, I work in animal care, and I've had a lot of my own dogs throughout my 42 whole years. That decision hasn't been easy because there were other factors like finances, quality of life. Like, ultimately, would I want to make that decision? No. Did I have the resources I needed to do anything else? No.
Yeah.
So you were kind of forced, and that is when it hurts even more, because it's different from knowing that this being or this person is on their very last legs and this is imminent.
Yeah.
But knowing that it's not, but you don't have the resources, like, and that's just a pet. That's not another human being. And that's not in a time of war. And again, these are things that most of us will never experience and can't even imagine.
And should count
And
ourselves lucky.
yes, very lucky. And that is where the calls for radical empathy and compassion come in, because it's something that we don't understand. And Chappell said specifically, war, it doesn't leave you. It can bury itself, but it's always there. War, it makes sense if you've been there, but it will never make sense.
Yep.
Yeah. And that particular line, I saw a few people who are combat veterans said that line really resonated with them.
Yeah.
I can imagine, yeah.
Davey is, I think, not on social media. Mr. Perez. I don't know Davey personally. But I would like to talk to him and just kind of find out, because I if you watch the Ready Room, both Babs and Melissa talk about having done some research, and Melissa especially, but having done research about vet experiences and everything. And so I'm just curious what the writers did to prepare and to write this episode and to make it resonate. I have my own personal experiences or personal opinions about serving for a country. And as I've said many times, I've chosen not to serve. It's not something that I want to do. But I have a myriad of family members and friends who have made that decision. And I still believe that choosing to do that, and especially choosing to go into a situation where you may be at war, is one of the most commendable things that you can do. And outside of the politics and all the crap surrounding it, I think that those specific people still deserve respect and honor. I mean, the ones that do it, not the people that co-opt soldiers to be snipers. But when I specifically have been seeking out the veteran response to this episode, because I do feel that their opinions deserve a certain amount of attention and respect. regardless of any personal opinions. And so I'm glad to see that this has resonated with so many, and has encouraged people to speak up and talk about their experiences. That's something that we're still normalizing today. And while Melissa Navia talked about grief and how talking about Brian, talking about his passing and the grief and the fact that he was there for all of season 1 with her. They went on that journey together, and they very much each other's best friend in person. And then he was gone. He was gone for this season. Makes me emotional. And hearing her talk about the fact that pretty much every day that they were filming, she would break down and cry. Like those you're carrying all that grief and all those feelings, and especially when it's new, it's right there. So the smallest thing or even just a thought can bring that right up. But she has seen a notable response from fans who thank her for talking about this journey through grief and loss and how it has empowered them to also talk about their experiences. And the more that we do that, like that is how you normalize, that is how you make a healthier human race, is by giving everybody the opportunity to let that out, to just give a voice to your pain, to be accepted, to be heard, and just to be hold that space for other people. And that's one reason why when I do podcasting now, and I mean, since I started podcasting about Discovery was really where my journey started, with kind of facing my own trauma around sexual assault because of some of the storyline there. But it has become so important to me to just be truthful and honest about these things, because it helps normalize and encourage other people to do the same. You don't have to do it on a podcast. Talk to a friend, talk to a therapist, talk to yourself, say it out loud. But being able to work through and deal with those feelings is so much healthier than keeping it pent up forever, because you're just holding on to that and it's hurting you by doing that. So yeah, this episode just gives me another opportunity to again talk about something I've never ever talked about, and I like practiced talking about my dad in the car. And like those first times I'm sitting there in my car like crying because of just, and we weren't close. We did not have a good relationship because of what he went through that made it impossible for him to be a good parent. But I do have that radical empathy, even for somebody who hurt me, to know what he went through, what he was forced to do, and how it changed him. That is what helps you come to a place of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And again, we just went back on like really serious. I'm like, okay, where's the funny stuff I can talk about?
Well, this part isn't necessarily funny, but I also really enjoyed the character of Vol Trask.
Yeah, he was
the Andorian.
Nice to see an Andorian. Thank you for remembering. For some reason, I've never put his name in my notes.
I looked him up on Memory Alpha just a little bit ago, just so I could do that.
There you go. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm curious to know a little bit more of that backstory that was hinted at, but that we didn't get, in their relationship. And I mean, that character's gone now.
Yep.
We'll probably get it in a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I hate to say.
As soon as we actually do get more books.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, we will. I don't want to, think otherwise.
And I know, like, the one other thing I think I wanted to bring up, because it again kind of lent itself to the ambiguity of the episode was Chapel covering for him.
Oh yeah.
And while she didn't see exactly what happened, I think that was an issue of camaraderie.
Yeah.
Having been there and known what they went through together, and also knowing, having those same feelings of, I didn't start the fight, but I'm not sad it happened or whatever.
Yeah.
That I very much could see service members doing that, because
Absolutely.
I don't think it would have been as easy for, I don't know. I think that it could have been more complicated without that witness. But yeah, I wish we'd gotten a little bit more from Chapel. Because she definitely, I don't know, I just wish the episode was longer.
Yeah.
Or more,
Yes.
or 22 episodes a season.
Yeah, let's have that.
But I definitely feel like, Chapel clearly at this point in the war had not faced the same terrors
No.
and such that Mbenga had, and was very new on the line, wanting to save everybody, struggling with realizing that you can't.
Yeah.
And then being affected by that. And I appreciate that Spock wanted to be there for her. I can also understand Spock doesn't have that experience.
Yeah.
Spock didn't live through that with her. And so she may feel that he can't provide what she needs in a conversation like that. And also, it's just really hard to revisit that. It's hard to sit down and talk about that stuff. It's, whether it's your boyfriend or your therapist, like that, it's hard.
And when it's a boyfriend, or when it's somebody you have a romantic relationship with, you might feel as though you don't want to burden them with that, and you don't want them to think of you differently.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I when having brought up Spock, I really liked that we're seeing what we know to be the beginnings of his diplomatic career.
Oh yeah.
That was just that was between the first episode and this. He is interacting with Klingons differently than other people on the ship, and I think that is going to be of influence later on.
Yeah, that's a great point.
More than his father is of influence in that case, I think.
I'm reading through some of your all's notes, and the fact that Mbenga hates himself because his unique ability to hurt is at odds with his oath as a physician. And again, that is such a struggle. And says, like O'Brien, he hates who he has become.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was definitely thinking of the wounded while watching this.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. I wanted to go back and watch all the different episodes that have been brought up in comparison or contrast with this episode, because it is something that Star Trek has visited before. I think I've seen it referred to as the anti-duet.
Yeah.
And I can see that. And I think someone else, and I don't know who said all these things, I'm sorry. But someone somewhere said that this was a conversation that Star Trek has been needing to have with itself for a long time. And it's something that we'd already talked about, where it's just it's not, that utopian vision isn't perfect, and it's not representative of what we're dealing with here. And it is, both things are true, that Star Trek is a vision of the future and Star Trek is a commentary on our current time.
Yeah.
And so I think it is important to give a voice to the issues in our current time and put those questions out there, especially. I don't know. I believe in Benga. I believe he didn't start the fight.
I do too.
That's where I stand on this episode. I am, as hard as it has been to read a lot of the commentary on social media, I'm grateful for always grateful for seeing different perspectives, different from my own, that make me think. And that to me is the core of what Star Trek is about and what it does. And I hope that everyone can remember that, and kind of approach this episode with the same objectiveness. Like, you can have your opinions, you can think what you want, walk away from it with a certain idea, but still be able to be objective, listen to the perceptions of others, and attempt to see how they got there. And then ultimately you can disagree. Like, that's part of, like, the debates don't need to be about, I want to convince you of this, and that you need to believe this because you're wrong. Like, that's not what it is. It's just, I want people to be able to see this from a myriad of perspectives, walk away with your own, but be able to say, oh yes, I see that, instead of just, no, absolutely not.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's something that I think is very easily forgotten in discussions.
Especially on Twitter
now. Yeah.
X Twitter, whatever we're calling it. I've really come to the conclusion that unless you're talking with a specific group of people that you know well, and even then,
even then it's not.
Yeah, these conversations just don't. You can't have them. I don't know my words. You just can't have them.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying.
Especially when you've got a character limit on how many things you can write. And you're lacking the emotions, the physical cues, the tone of voice, and everything else when portraying certain thoughts, saying certain things. It just gets very lost. And then the last thing you need is Spock number 247-850-1701 jumping in to just be a jerk. Like, I'm sorry, but even if your perspective or opinion is valid, you don't need to be a jerk. That's not going to get people to listen and be receptive.
Yeah, no.
So that just kind of ruins it for everybody. And I hate to say this, but after I left Twitter last year, I was off Twitter for 6 months or more. I have pretty much taken my discussion of Star Trek to a private Discord that is behind a paywall. And I mean, you only have to pay $1 to join, but in that space, for the most part, and it's a moderated space, we're able to have more fleshed out discussions and share those perspectives and do so without it devolving into people just being mean to each other and name calling and blocking and everything else. It's easier to get to a place where let's agree to disagree and move on. Instead of turning into something else entirely. And that's just me. That's just where I feel safer talking about those things. Another great opportunity is going to conventions and talking in person, or, getting together on Zoom and everything else. But
yeah, in my experience, you are far less likely to have someone scream at you that you're, the evil person for your opinions on Star Trek at a convention.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That might be selection bias, but sure.
For the most part, my experiences, primarily at the Las Vegas convention, I've been to a few others, but primarily there, are that the people who attack and bully and treat me poorly on social media are too intimidated to do that in person because there are consequences.
Yep.
And so they will generally ignore you, never talk to you, never interact. However, Star Trek fans, just like any other human being, are humans, and some people are jerks.
Mhm.
And so I can't guarantee that anyone's going to go to a convention and not run into one or two of those jerks.
No, I have definitely run into jerks at conventions. I had in 2021, I had a guy go off on me for wearing a name tag with pronouns on it. But in general,
it's a much better experience, and still most of my conversations about specific episodes and whatnot tend to happen with people I know. And that's just because I'm hanging out with people I know at 2 a.m. when these conversations pop up.
As one does.
Yeah. But overall, I tend to find that they are good places with like-minded people.
Like-minded people.
Yeah, and that's again a whole other Pandora's box to open. But at least when we are at a convention, I like to think that everybody is there to talk about Star Trek, except those people that want to go off on your pronouns or whatever else. And that's a situation where, I don't know, it's not quite a block and move on. It's more like walk away, disengage. You've got a panel to go to.
Yeah, no, I straight up told him, like, I am not having this conversation, and walked away.
Yep. I think it just speaks to, I like to say, and many people say that Star Trek fans are like the best of humanity. And I think that plenty of other people who are not Star Trek fans are also representative of the best of humanity, that we're all just people making our way through this journey, and no group of people is really any better than another. But I would like to think that we can at least treat each other with respect. And
I mean, I would venture to say you get more decent people at a Star Trek convention than, say, at, I don't know, what's the what's the name of that big conservative thing? CPAC.
Oh yeah.
God, yeah. I was about to say the RNC. So good.
That
too.
Yeah. I
don't think that's in question.
No, yeah. It's, I'm just gonna back away. Sharing more opinions about that.
If we have listeners who are offended by those sorts of opinions, they are very thick-skinned, because we've been saying stuff like this for years.
Good to know.
Yep.
Good to know. I think the thing is, like, for the most part, people seem to leave their politics at the door until politics come up in some, like, until they are confronted by politics at a convention, whether it's a pronoun pin or a celebrity bringing up somebody. That's when that stuff starts to happen. But I mean, Thad, you just talked about seeing Oppenheimer, and
oh boy,
I think that was you sitting next to some people who, what is this woke bullshit? 5 minutes in or something.
Well, no, they waited until the end. At the end, when the credits rolled, they were then talking about how it was liberal bullshit and commie propaganda. And I'm just like, one, why did you sit through a 3-hour movie you didn't like? Two,
because they were waiting to see the bomb blow up and kill people.
Yeah,
that's why.
Yeah,
exactly.
No, that's it. They were hoping it was going to be patriot porn about how great the bomb was.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the sad reason why people say that certain people watch Star Trek for the pew-pews and the war stuff and shit. And
I mean, I have definitely had plenty of interactions with very right-wing Trekkies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It blows my mind, but yep.
It does. And, again, I've talked about the fact that on one hand, I'm really cautious about people. On the other hand, I still want to believe in the best of people. And that's where I fall into that trap. It can be really
I
difficult.
still remember talking to like 4 different people in STOB in 2021. I mean, selection bias in this case, because I'm sure there were the percentage of people at STOB in 2021 probably skewed more conservative just because it was the COVID con.
Yep.
But these were people that I had been on, friendly acquaintance terms with at previous cons, but we were talking, and like 4 different, they were all middle-aged white guys. Surprise, surprise. And talking to them, and all 4 of them said, I asked, are you going to go to Mission Chicago next year? And all 4 of them, these are different conversations, not like the same one big conversation. All 4 of them said, oh no, Chicago's far too dangerous to go to.
Yeah.
When I do see people reacting to Mbenga as an angry black man in this episode, they tend to be a specific kind of person.
Yep.
Sorry, and that is why I asked that we examine our racial biases, which is not something that those people can typically do. It is a struggle for me because I work really hard not to paint people into specific corners because of their political beliefs. I do work really hard because I do want to believe that the ultimate goal of humanity is to put aside those differences and come to a place where we can all support each other and accept each other and move forward for the better of humanity. And by that, I mean all people, all human beings. And so I don't look at somebody and see that they are, Republican and think that's a bad person. I know what they believe. No, I don't. Unfortunately, a lot of the times it does turn out that is who they are. And
yeah. And no, same. None of my close friends are, but I definitely am friendly with people who are. And that's the way I'm saying this.
Yes.
I definitely am friendly with people who have far more right-wing views than I do. And I would not completely ostracize them and take them out of my life until such time as they espouse certain far more right-wing views than I have. And then, yes, you're gone. But yeah, otherwise, no, well, for one thing, I would like to think that people can change. And for another, I mean, there's a lot of diversity of thought in the world.
There's a huge difference between being conservative about, let's say, taxes and deciding that slavery wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
Okay. The slavery wasn't a bad thing. I do know what kind of person you are if you tell me that and you believe it. But
Chrissy, what about all those skills they learned?
Oh, don't even get me started. Don't even, So it's when people tell you who they are, you have to believe them.
Right.
And then you act accordingly, but because somebody voted for Reagan in 1984, that doesn't make them bad.
A lot of people follow, not lead. A lot of people choose ignorance because it's easy. And there are a lot of people who have never spent any substantial amount of time interacting with Black people, LGBTQ people, trans people. I mean, that falls under the umbrella, but this is what I believe. And I was forced to leave Colorado, where I had lived for 15, almost 16 years. And I have returned to South Florida, where over Memorial Day weekend, I was driving to a work thing, and there were people in the corner outside of a news station with flags that said, "You choose, pedos or Nazis." And I mean, there were maybe 10 people, so it wasn't like a mass demonstration. And I do want to believe that these are a minority. That doesn't make them any less dangerous.
Right.
But I've been here for 6 months, and have reconnected. God, I hope nobody listens to this podcast that knows me. I'm not putting it on Facebook. I have interacted with people who I knew years ago that have only confirmed to me. Do I think these people are terrible, bad people? No.
Sure.
But I, as a woman presenting but non-binary human being who is queer, if you make a comment and you compare a Nazi flag to a pride flag, you've just told me you're not a safe person for me.
Yeah.
If we have a conversation where you talk about denying someone, I'm trying to make this not specific. It doesn't matter. The person's not going to listen. If you have a conversation about denying people accessibility to something that could make their life easier as being neurodiverse, because you feel you're implying that their neurodiversity is a weakness, you're not a safe person for me. My brain is not, as far as I know, neurodivergent by birth. My brain is neurodivergent by trauma. And while I understand that apparently it can, not cured, that's not a word I would ever use, but that is what people have said, but that I can go back to having a neurotypical brain if I work hard enough or something. No, I don't think that's going to happen for me. So if you say those things, even though I still may believe that you are inherently not a murderous, terrible, awful person, you're still leading me to believe that you are not safe for me to be around, especially privately.
No, absolutely. I'm from central Pennsylvania. This is hardly a bastion of liberalism. And there are people I grew up with, people I knew from, the handful of high school friends that I still have on Facebook or whatever, that I still talk to occasionally. Like, some of them say some pretty, some things that definitely mean that I don't really want to have that much to do with you. And I'm not necessarily saying they're bad people, but they are not people that I need to make a part of my life.
Yeah. Like, we have to coexist is my thing. Because we are all human beings, we have to coexist. I would love to see us work together to do things like, save the planet.
That'd be a good idea.
And unfortunately, our political ideologies tend to set. I don't know. I've only lived here, like I said, 42 years. It feels like we have become more and more divisive. And I think that a lot of that division, especially when it comes to certain human rights, for people, comes from almost a chosen ignorance.
Yes.
Like, you have, like, just I'm a curse. It really pains me, because I have seen the evidence of people who would do something like compare a pride flag to a Nazi flag, and say, well, I don't know anybody like that. And queer people are not a monolith. There are conservative queer people in the world. Same as that, Black people are not a monolith. They don't all think the same. Like, there's still a diversity there. But when you don't have experience with a certain type of people, especially trans people, you can make some friends, meet some people, learn about them, learn from them about their life experiences. And maybe that can help lead you towards having some empathy and compassion for what they're going through and for why those suicide rates are so high. And maybe educate yourself on what the process is of transitioning. Like, there's a whole medical process there that is in place to protect people.
Yep.
Let's say. And I can understand how these biases and discrimination and prejudices and hate develop because we remain ignorant. The least you can do is educate yourself, and some people are not willing to do that because it doesn't affect them. And that's just really sad. To me, the Roddenberry flat out says so many times and so many quotes, like, this is about accepting our differences, celebrating our differences, accepting people as they are. Like Mr. Rogers,
Yeah.
I grew up with Mr. Rogers, so
Me too.
I
Yes,
feel
me
like, and I don't know if Gene and Fred were friends. But
I'd love to think they were.
I would too. I think that they would be.
Fred Rogers probably not quite so womanizing, but other than that.
Correct. Agree with that. But again, like that is where you, like, I'm at a loss for how people read those quotes and say that they believe those things, but then sweep aside the reality of really educating yourself to understand people who are unlike you. And it's something that I see from my side of the political spectrum and people I know, that instead of judging somebody for who you think they are, and I think a good example of this is Chase Masterson, who years ago, and I don't think she's still doing it, she may be, but years ago would give her personal phone number to prisoners in the justice system to just talk, to listen to them, to support them, to help them find a better path forward, learn about who they are, what got them to where they are, etc. And that to me is a good example of somebody doing that work. Choosing to remain ignorant, choosing to remain Klingon.
I was going to say, we are coming back to the episode here beautifully.
Yeah, that is not doing the work. And that's all I asked. Do the work. Do the work to get to that better version of humanity, if that's truly what you believe in.
Yeah. They don't believe that's the thing, that the people that are there for the pews don't believe in that.
But yeah. I still would challenge.
I don't disagree. We should still ask them to do the work.
Yes.
But...
And that's where, again, I just kind of set myself up sometimes for disappointment, because I still believe that there's a possibility to reach through to people to get them to that place. And that is what I am committed to doing for the rest of my life. But some people just are not there. And no matter how hard I try to do that, they're not receptive. And that is the harsh reality. And I think that also kind of plays into this episode.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I think it does.
I think I need a drink after this.
Yeah. Well, we'll have the palate cleanser of recording our episode 7 this evening.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
and that was the right direction to go, thankfully. Went after this and not the
that worked out well.
Yeah. Again, I have appreciated the fact that we get a break. And it's not just this every week. I can't do that with television anymore. I will avoid watching shows like that because I just cannot sit in that darkness. And there's so much shit about Discovery being so dark. And I'm not trying to paint that picture. It's just the tone and the heaviness of some storylines is difficult, and it is difficult.
Picard is way darker than Discovery.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yep. It's hard to sit through that week upon week and then talk about it. And that's the other thing, is that as podcasters, you don't get to just leave it and walk away and stop thinking about it. You're taking notes. You're watching the episode 4 or 5, at least for me.
Oh, yeah.
Many times.
I'm always watching at least 2, usually 3, before
Yeah,
every
same.
episode.
Yeah. This one I think I have watched 5 times.
This one I saw. This one I saw twice. I mean, it's a very good episode, but I just didn't want to keep watching it.
Yeah.
I think if the screeners had closed captions, I would have only watched it once.
I
would.
do
Oh, yeah,
wish-
that's a fair point.
Yeah.
But no, I always watch the screener when it comes out, and then
Yeah,
always try to watch the episode itself like an hour before we record, just to.
I think that for me, it was just because of I wanted to make sure that I spoke about this episode the right way for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole thing. Mission Log is actually stepping away and going on a reprieve because of the strikes. After Rod and Trevor went to San Diego Comic-Con, and it is specifically because the Roddenberry name is on there.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
They just decided, let's take a step back. But we're still doing Mission Log Live. So last week's show was a very last minute change of John and I can't talk about the show, but you can call in and talk about things.
Oh, okay.
And like
That's a format change, yeah.
It still worked out fine. Thankfully, I can, John is so professional and he knows just what to say. Because I was just kind of like, yeah. So it worked out, and we're going to continue the season with that format and letting people call in. And I was like, well, can I still go on a podcast and talk about it? And he was like, yeah, like go do your thing. I'm not a SAG member. I'm not ever going to be a SAG member.
And this is not an official promoted anything.
Right. So like, yeah. So I was actually very fortunate to get to come on and talk about this episode. And so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
But yeah,
Well,
especially like thinking about how I relate through my own personal experiences, and then my father's story, and just wanting to be sure that like I was talking about this episode the way that I wanted, and specifically involving a Black male character. And I hope that came off okay and people won't hate me.
I don't think people will hate
Made sense to me.
I do feel like if I had tweeted about it, it may not have come across
Well, that's a different thing
the
entirely.
right way.
If you tweet about anything, it will not come across the right way to someone.
Right. Like there's always that. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to say what I wanted to say on both subjects. Hopefully in a way that does not piss off people that I care about, whose opinions I respect, and who I, admire and don't want to upset. Because that's not it. And like I said, I do think that yes, it can be problematic, but this episode I think doesn't essentially do that. I do think it can play on personal biases, as we've seen in the reaction. And for that, I think it was worth bringing up and talking about.
I think we've covered most everything we can on this one for this week.
Yeah.
So stay tuned next week as we continue to change the tone quite a bit. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can listeners find you online? And do you have any current or upcoming work you want to mention?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful that I got to talk about this episode and share my thoughts. It's meant a lot, actually. You can find me on Monday nights at 10 o'clock on Facebook and YouTube on Mission Log Live. We love having people call in. Our format has shifted a little bit with the strikes. We, as Roddenberry Entertainment, are definitely taking a step back and still having the shows, but I don't really get to talk about the episodes, but listeners can still call in and talk about those episodes. So we'd love to see you there. Those episodes do come out in podcast format, so you can read them. You can listen to them. Wow. You can listen to them wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at @BatlethBabe. I'm back with a smaller, hopefully safer account where I just missed everybody. I missed my friends who aren't on other social medias, and quite honestly, there's nothing quite like X Twitter, and how we communicate and share our thoughts there. And I also found that I was missing perspectives of people that I need. I feel like I need, and how I ingest and interpret Star Trek. So I am there. As for the future, I would just say stay tuned. Follow me on X Twitter, and I might have an announcement if you show up to our Trektivism panel on Sunday at Star Trek Las Vegas, or whatever you're supposed to call it.
STLV, the 57-year mission tour.
The fun thing is that on Mission Log Live, we were referring to it as that convention in the desert, Star Convention in the desert or something. I don't know. We were being funny about it.
It is officially STLV again. The letters just don't stand for anything.
Right, exactly. I'm like, we can still call it that. But yeah, I might have some information there. Regardless, Trektivism and our panel is Federation of Changemakers, talking about how both fans and actors are working as catalysts to create the change that is needed to get to that vision that Gene Roddenberry so expertly shows us with Star Trek. And if you are going to STLV, feel free to join us in the Star Trek Convention Experiences group on Facebook. I, alongside many of our friends, help admin that group, and it's a great resource if you're going to the convention. So that's where you can find me, and stay tuned, and I hope to see you on Sunday at the Trektivism panel.
I just want to say before we go on, I really do appreciate you sharing your personal story with this, and that can be difficult, and it can be difficult for people to hear too, but it's worthwhile, it's important, and it's appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Chrissy, where can people find you when you are not going to an event just to eat jambalaya?
Depends on who's making it, but yeah. Right. In addition to here on Infinite Diversity, you can find me on History with Szilagyi here on the BQN, the twice weekly short history podcast I do with my fellow historian partner, Jason. I'm also happy to chat about our shows in the BQN Collective on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at the Goddess Livia, where I tweet about Star Trek history and leftist politics. Thad, where can people find you when you're not discussing the finer nuances of ambassadorial roles? I don't know. Ambassadorial duties. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, there we go.
You can find me on the website formerly known as Twitter, where I am at Tyrannicus, that's Tyranicus. I am also on Blue Sky and Mastodon with that same name, but a little more complicated. And you can find me there if you search for Tyrannicus. I cross-post most things to all three places because the world is burning and I still want to talk to my friends.
Yeah.
You can also hear me on the podcast I do with my friend Carl called License to Spiel. That's licensed with a C like the British do it, where we talk about James Bond and James Bond adjacent things and get further and further adjacent as... I don't know, does further adjacent mean closer or farther away? Less and less adjacent. There we go.
Yeah, less and less, yeah.
As we begin to run out of things to say about Bond.
All right. Well, don't forget all of our other great shows on the BQN, and here's Amy Nelson to tell you all about them.
What shows are on BQN, you ask? Well, here's a rundown of some podcasts you might be interested in. All Good Things, a Star Trek Universe podcast covering all of Trek, hosted by Amy, Mark, Christos, and Kelvin. Bargain Bin Gamer, a YouTube show hosted by Davey, a self-proclaimed gamer who specializes in reviewing and showcasing affordable video games. If you're lost in the Delta Quadrant, check out The Captain's Couch, a Star Trek Voyager podcast hosted by Jeremiah sitting on Janeway's Ready Room couch. Cinema Z, a film discussion and review podcast showcasing films you probably missed but should definitely check out. Hosted by Mark, Matt, and Laz. Beam Aboard the Galaxy Class, a Star Trek Next Generation podcast covering all of TNG. Hosted by Amy, Joe, Rhea, and Kevin. History with the Szilagys, a snippet of historical events from around the world, hosted by Chrissy and Jason. For the newest Trek coverage, check out Infinite Diversity, hosted by Chrissy and Thad. Test your Trek knowledge with Treksperts Quiz, a Star Trek quiz show hosted and written by Davey. Union Federation, covering all things Star Trek and the Orville, which we all know is really a Star Trek show. Hosted by Kyle, Kevin, Amy, and Haley. Spill the Tea with What's the Tea, Bev? A Trek current events and fan interview show hosted by Christos. And for our Patreon members, we have The Hive Mind, BQN's monthly roundtable discussion with hosts and listeners. It's Green, a cornucopia of topics hosted by Mark, and Amy's Math Moments, a quick look at math moments in Star Trek, hosted by Amy. We know you have a choice of podcasts to choose from, and we thank you for listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Thank you very much for tuning into Infinite Diversity. Thank you to Zach Tripp for the wonderful theme music and Mark White for the awesome show art. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well.
And if you'd like to reach out, you can find the network on, as we're saying, the website formerly known as Twitter, at BQN Podcasts, or our show specifically at IDIC Podcast. And you can also talk about any and all of our BQN podcasts in the Facebook group, the BQN Collective. When you next hear from us, we will be having a definite tone change and talking about
literal tone change.
Literal, yeah, that's true. We'll be talking about the first ever musical episode of Star Trek, and that is Subspace Rhapsody. And don't expect me to sing. Until then, we bid you peace and long life.
Don't expect me to sing either.
That works. Good deal.
That's how we lose listeners, is if we sing in that episode.
Yeah. For sure.